Welcome everybody to this short version, actually a bird's eye view of a 40-minute lecture that was developed to help celebrate the 50th anniversary of the National Institute of Alcoholism and Alcohol Abuse. I'll call it the National Alcohol Institute for short. My job today is to review some of the major points that were made in the original lecture. And the material was originally prepared to honor the National Alcohol Institute and all of the help that it has been to me for the 35 years to 40 years of study that have gone into the prospective work that I've done, especially with introducing you to the San Diego prospective study, as well as several other studies that I've been fortunate enough to be able to participate in. So what are we going to cover in this brief period of time? The first thing will be an overview of why one would even begin to conclude that heavy drinking and alcohol use disorders, which I'll abbreviate as AUDs in these slides, but how heavy drinking and alcohol use disorders have a genetic component. The story actually goes back to the 1960s. There was plenty of evidence that genes were involved in these very complex conditions of heavy drinking and alcohol problems. Then among the genetically influenced characteristics is the low intensity of response, also low level of response, abbreviated as low LR, as a risk factor for alcohol use disorders, but it doesn't have an impact on other substance use disorders. Then we'll talk very briefly about one of the major sources of information for us regarding genetic influences in alcohol use disorders that occur via the low level of response to alcohol. And that will be the San Diego prospective study, a brief discussion of genes and environment as they relate to the low level of response, and then finish off with why should you care? Well, there are hopefully a bunch of reasons why you should care about this information, but one of them will be demonstrated to you when I discuss a second study that grew out of the original one, and that uses what we've learned about the low level of response to alcohol to put together a prevention study in individuals carrying that risk factor. So let's begin with a very rapid overview of what data are there that genes contribute to the risk for heavy drinking and repetitive alcohol problems. The first bit of information is that children of alcoholics, individuals with an alcohol use disorder, that children of those individuals have a 3 and some will say 4-fold increased risk for alcohol use disorders themselves. But it's not just because it's running in families. From the standpoint of the environment, because that increased risk for those offspring is there even if the children are adopted away at birth and raised without knowledge of their biological parents' problems. That sure indicates the probability of a genetic component. The second bit of information, and there are multiples, is that the closer your genetic relationship to somebody with an alcohol use disorder, the higher your risk. So, for example, identical twins of individuals with alcohol use disorders, that is that they share 100% of their genes, have a significantly higher risk for alcoholism, perhaps 70-ish% risk for alcohol use disorders, than do fraternal twins, born at the same time, but different eggs and sperm, and share only 50% of their genes. The higher risk in identical versus fraternal twins is also very supportive of the importance of genes in the development of alcohol use disorders. But these data also show that environment is important. Otherwise, 100% of the identical twins of individuals with alcohol use disorders would themselves develop alcohol use disorders. So the old argument, is it genetic or is it environment? The answer is yes, because it is G plus E, genes plus environment, that are acting together. How do you apply that then to the risk for heavy drinking and repetitive problems related to alcohol? The data from the twin studies and the family studies indicate that the risk for an alcohol use disorder is roughly 60% genetic and 40% environment. Both are very important. And some studies would show slightly different proportions, such as maybe it's 50-50, but genes are still a very important part of that risk. And it is not an alcoholic gene that gets inherited, but rather genes related to characteristics. And each of those genetically influenced characteristics that impact on the alcoholism risk are themselves likely to be genes, multiple genes, plus environment. That's a very complex. So what are those intermediate or additional characteristics that are impacting on either increasing or decreasing the risk for heavy drinking and repetitive alcohol-related problems? Well, there are many. The first to be discovered was a protective factor, not absolute, but a modestly protective factor related to how you metabolize alcohol, especially regarding the production of the first breakdown product of alcohol, acetaldehyde. It's been known for many years that, second, if you are very impulsive, don't think much before you do things, that you also have a high risk, but that's for all substance use disorders. There are also several psychiatric disorders that increase your risk indirectly for alcohol and drug use disorders, especially bipolar or manic depressive disease and schizophrenia. But I'm going to focus on an additional characteristic, which is how sensitive you are to alcohol and whether or not you have a low level of response or low LR per drink from very early in your drinking career and long before tolerance to any significant effect was likely to have been acquired. It's more like sensitivity to alcohol that's involved. And what is the low level of response to alcohol? Let me review then briefly what that is and what the rationale is to begin to look at the low level of response to alcohol. Rationale number one, most people begin drinking in their adolescence. As an adolescent or young adult, you are often drinking for the effect, intoxication, for example. If you need more alcohol in a situation where more alcohol is available to get the effect that you're after, you're going to drink more per occasion. Once you start spending more time drinking and consuming higher levels of alcohol, you tend to hang out with people who also drink heavily. Those help change your expectations so that you believe, for example, the best way to have a good time is to get a lot of alcohol down quickly. That can then create stress, and you start to use alcohol with stress and so on. But there is a model that we developed many years ago about how the low level of response to alcohol, a genetically influenced characteristic that itself runs in families and probably has a heritability of about 40%. That is a proportion of the risk explained by genes of about 40%, how that might operate. Now, how would you test that? Beginning in the mid-1970s, we tested this hypothesis that the low sensitivity per drink is likely to be related to the alcoholism risk. What we did is we took two groups, those with a family history of alcoholism, green line here, as well as those with no family history of alcoholism, and we matched the two groups on usual recent drinking, age, sex, race, etc., and gave the alcohol orally, consumed over about 10 minutes, and then watched as you can see, because the left side of this slide, the left side is blood alcohol concentration, which goes up to about 0.06 grams per 100 milliliters of blood and comes down. But the two groups, the way we gave the alcohol, their blood alcohol levels on average were identical over time. We would be following them for 3 to 4 hours in the laboratory. While the blood alcohol levels were identical, the intensity of response to those blood alcohol levels were different. And the major finding was that this green line, those at high risk for alcohol use disorders based on their family history, were in general showing lower responses during that period of time that the two groups had identical blood alcohol levels. And the low responses were on subjective feelings of intoxication, on body sway, on brain waves, on changes in hormones, etc. So the low level of response to alcohol is one of many characteristics that are genetically influenced and that impact on heavy drinking and the probability of developing alcohol problems enough to be called alcohol use disorders. The problem with the alcohol challenge is it takes all day and it is very expensive. So we developed a second way of trying to measure someone's response to alcohol. And in this instance, it is asking people who are already drinkers to think back to 3 periods in their life, the first 5 to 10 times they drank, and the recent 3 months of drinking, and their heaviest period of drinking, and tell us how many standard drinks, such as 12 ounces of beer, 4 ounces of wine, or a single shot of 80 proof beverage, how many standard drinks it took to begin to feel any effect, to feel dizzy or as if they're slurring their speech, to start stumbling, and how many drinks it took for them to fall asleep when they didn't want to, only counting experiences they actually had, and then creating a score for this self-report of the effects of alcohol, the SRE, of this score, which was the average for a time period. That is the total number of drinks across the effects divided by the number of effects that they reported. 2 ways to measure the low level of response to alcohol. Important for the lecture that was delivered to the NIAAA, the full lecture, was to show that in a prospective study, such as our own 35 to 40 year San Diego prospective study, that the low level of response to alcohol at one point in life predicts heavier drinking and alcohol problems later in life. And I will come back to that San Diego prospective study in a few minutes. Also been able to show that the low response to alcohol relates to future heavier drinking and alcohol problems in a United Kingdom, UK study called the Avon Longitudinal Study of Parents and Children, and in the very large US-based collaborative study on genetics of alcoholism, and in other studies. Not every study demonstrates low response related to risk, and low response then predicts alcohol outcomes, but the majority do, and indeed the large majority do. So what is this San Diego prospective study? And let's take a look at it, because we focused on trying to find both genes related to characteristics such as the low response to alcohol, as well as the environment. Now, the environment could be studied because we were following people over time about every 5 years. Started with 453 young, originally men, who were about age 21, gave the alcohol challenge to determine the low response to alcohol. And we've been following them. Roughly 90% after 35 years are still with us. And we've been following them over time. And as they married or set up long-term relationships and had children, the spouse and the children entered the study. The offspring or children entered the study primarily once they began to become drinkers, usually after the age of 18. And so from this 35-year study, where now the original 21-year-old original subjects are now 55 to 60, and their children who are drinking, there are about 220 of those offspring who are an average age of 28. And we can search for both genes and environment related to the level of response to alcohol. And we also study the environment, as I mentioned, and here is just a schematic of course, the low level of response there in white is related to a bunch of different things, but it's also related to the family history of alcoholism. We've shown in our prospective study in both the original subjects and in their offspring, that the low level of response to alcohol directly predicts HD, that's heavy drinking and alcohol problems, but also correlates with heavy drinking peers, as we predicted, expectations that are unhealthy regarding how much alcohol you should take in order to have a good time, levels of stress, and whether you use alcohol to cope with stress. And indeed, the model turned out to be correct. About half of the relationship of level of response to alcohol goes directly into heavy drinking and alcohol problems. And the rest of it is indirectly through the impact of peers. You can help people change peers or how peers affect them. Expectancies, you can help people to change attitudes, and using alcohol to cope with stress. And you should be able to educate people who have a low response to alcohol how to modify how they deal with stress. Now, part of our work was to try and look at variations in genes that are contributing to level of response, but that is beyond what we're going to talk about today, except to say that there is work going on identifying genes that explain, each gene explaining a very small proportion of the risk for that low response. And not everything I have on the board here has been shown to my satisfaction or anyone else's to actually link in to the level of response, but at least we're looking. So we're going to end this brief talk by saying, well, if I understand the characteristic low response to alcohol, and I understand the environmental characteristics that can either magnify or minimize the effect of low response on later heavy drinking and alcohol problems, I should be able to put a prevention study together. And we did, and we published that several years ago. Here's the prevention study. Brand new sample. We identified 500 18-year-old students at the University of California, San Diego. We sent out a questionnaire to identify those who were drinking, had some experience with alcohol, got about a 73% response rate through multiple mailings, and identified those who on this SRE, that self-response questionnaire, those individuals who required a lot more drinks for effects than average, those are the low responders per drink, and then the people who are more sensitive to alcohol, and we matched every low responder with a high responder. Then we divided these 500 drinking students into 3 groups. The easiest to explain is the third group up there, controls. We have their information. We're going to follow them 7 times over 55 weeks, but we don't do anything. There's no intervention. Then there are 2 intervention groups. The intervention groups each have 4 videotapes, 1 per week over the first 4 weeks of the study. One of them gives information about alcohol and dangers and ways to avoid problems, and focuses very much on the low level of response to alcohol. As an example, whenever a risk factor or something that might add or detract from the risk factor is mentioned. Then there was another prevention group, the state of the art or SOTA group, and that group got exactly the same information, except the emphasis and the examples given was really spread out among all the different kinds of risk factors that might occur. So you have a very focused giving of information, intervention. You have a generic giving of the same information without a focus on level of response and controls. And we followed people up for 55 weeks. What did we find? Well, across the bottom of the slide is the time of evaluation up to 55 weeks. Across on the left-hand side, going up and down, are the number of maximum drinks reported. I could also give you usual drinks reported. I could also give you problems. I focused in this short lecture on the maximum drinks. Let's take a look at what happened to the people with the low response to alcohol who were in the control group, no intervention. Their drinking, maximum number of drinks, started at about 7, peaked at about 10. That That peak, by the way, was during a period of, unfortunately, heavy drinking festival that occurred on campus. But it went from 7 drinks and then up over a period of time. Those are the controls. What happened to the low responders to alcohol who were given the generic information mentioning low response, but not emphasizing it? They had lower max drinks over time. What about the individuals who had a low response to alcohol, and not only a low response, but they got into an education group that gave them information that emphasized low response? They were significantly the lowest of all. Well, what about the people who were pretty sensitive to alcohol? Well, people who were pretty sensitive to alcohol, it didn't matter whether they went in a prevention group or not, or controls, or which of the 2 prevention groups that they were in. So we've shown you alcoholism is genetically influenced. One of the characteristics is the low response to alcohol. The low response to alcohol has been studied in a prospective study across 2 generations. Things were learned about the environmental characteristics that amplified the low response to alcohol as a risk factor. And then we took that to a brand new study and demonstrated that taking people with the low response, educating them intensively about their response to alcohol and risk can help decrease the impact of low response on maximum drinks or alcohol problems. Here are our conclusions. Heavy drinking and alcohol use disorders are genetically influenced. One way that the gene influences occur is through a low level of response to alcohol. And for us, we've been involved in multiple investigations, but the major prospective study is a 35 to 40 year across 2 generations San Diego prospective study that established the low level of response to alcohol as a risk factor and found environmental mediators, contributors to whether that low response results in heavy drinking or not. That led to an effective prevention program for people with low responses regarding trying to help them to minimize the impact of that low response on their future problems. And as I started out, this lecture was developed to honor the National Institute of Alcoholism and Alcohol Abuse. And so none of this work could have been done without the NIAAA. Thank you for your attention. I hope you have time perhaps to look at the full video, but in the meantime, it's been my pleasure to have the opportunity of giving you this bird's eye view of the low response to alcohol as a risk factor for alcohol use disorders.